If you were asked to imagine where the first armored car robbery took place, where would you think? Because you're here and listening to me, you're probably going to assume it occurred in Pennsylvania, and you're right. Good job using context clues. But where in Pennsylvania? Would you guess Philadelphia? Is that because you just suspect the worst of Philadelphians? No. The first armored car robbery occurred in the Bethel Park area, immediately south of Pittsburgh, and that time still known predominantly as a mining area. The date is March 11th, 1927, and the story is that of Paul Jaworski, the Flathead Gang, and the first armored car robbery.
Dear listeners, Dr. Pennsylvania.
Paul Jaworski, born Polazinski, immigrated to the United States from Poland around 1905. Paul was a young child at the time, 4 or 5 years old. It's not exactly known, and not too much is known about his earliest years, aside from the fact that his family was Catholic and lived in the Cleveland area. Much would be made in later years about Jaworski's religious background, as he boldly denied last rites prior to his execution at Rockview State Correctional Institute in Center County. Jaworski said that he was an atheist, and he had been since leaving the church as a child, and that only a coward would crawl back to God and the church in their final moments. Some reports state that he even helped the prison officials strap himself into the electric chair. But that wouldn't happen until January 21st, 1929, and I'm getting way ahead of myself. All accounts suggest that the Jaworski family moved to the Cleveland, Ohio area shortly after arriving in the United States. Cleveland was a rough city at the time, and really, this is unexceptional for a Rust Belt city of the industrial North at the time. However, by the mid-1920s, a young Paul Jaworski, if not the leader, a high-ranking member of the Flatheads, also known as the Flathead family, which was a Polish-led gang involved in Detroit, Toledo, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. Some things I've read have suggested that they've had ties to some New York family, but I don't know if I entirely buy that. Other things I've read claim that the Flathead name had to do with Paul's own head kind of being flat. And again, I don't know if I buy that as well. I'd like to think personally, and I have no real good reason for this, but I'd like to think that Flathead had to do with the motors that were in many cars, which are actually flatheads. But I have really no good reason to believe that either. It just sounds better than some guy having a flat head. On March 11, 1927, 2 Brinks armored cars left Pittsburgh and made payroll rounds to the mines operated by the Pittsburgh Terminal Coal Company. A lead truck, most likely a late model Ford Model A. I've seen some photographs of these being used and branded by the Brinks Company. Anyway, a lead truck carried the pay from the miners' last 2 weeks of the month of February. A second car, following them, an escort car, was close behind and had 5 armed guards sitting inside. Shortly before noon, and with several more stops to go, the 2 trucks were driving on time down Bethel Road when explosions from underneath blew that lead truck off the road and onto its roof. Moments later, a second explosion, roughly 60 feet behind the first, swallowed the escort vehicle. On a side note, if you were to go into Google and do a Google image search for Brinks Armored Vehicle 1927, as I did, you'll come across 3 photographs from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette archives. 2 of those photographs show both vehicles after the explosions, after this robbery. A third photograph shows a injured Paul Jaworski following a shootout at a Cleveland restaurant where he was ultimately apprehended. But check it out. The exact area where this robbery took place is across the street from the Bethel Park Shopping Center on Route 88. 1927's Bethel Road is now known as Brightwood Road. You can see it from the Giant Eagle in the Bethel Park Shopping Center. And if you drive a short distance past a Rite Aid on Brightwood Road, you'll come to some trees on the roadside. And maybe being there, you can get an idea of what the area looked like 90 years ago when Paul Jaworski and members of his Flathead gang sprang from behind the trees and robbed the stunned Brinks employees without firing a shot. Nobody died in the robbery, and the Flathead gang made out with more than $103,000. $103,000 in 1927. I'm not going to do the math for you, but you probably already know just what that sort of money was looking like in 1927. The driver of the lead vehicle stated that he came back around in time to see the gang of approximately 9 men driving off in 2 vehicles, notably a blue Stearns Knight touring car. Stearns Knight was a luxury vehicle that was made in Ohio in the Cleveland area. In 1925, it was purchased by Willys Overland, and then during the stock market crash, it was one of the first car companies to actually go under. The getaway car, that Stearns Knight touring car, had Pennsylvania plates, and the Brinks driver took note. The rest of the Brinks crew came to quickly. They walked to the nearest mine, their next stop, but they were unable to call for police at that stop because the explosion had knocked down the telephone wires that serviced the mine. The police were not on the scene until nearly 1 in the afternoon. The police searched the area, including Library Road, now Route 88, and still known as Library Road, though. They followed up on the license plate of the Stearns Knight, and it took them to a man in Washington County who stated that his car had not been involved, he had clearly not been involved, and the fact that his car was in his garage at that moment. His license plate, though, had been stolen, though he wasn't aware of it at the time. Following a tip from a woman in the Bentleyville area of Washington County, the Pennsylvania State Police closed in on a Polish-owned farm belonging to the Wachowski family. There, the authorities stumbled onto Paul and 2 other members of the Flatheads. Mr. Wachowski, who owned the farm, claimed ignorance of the gang, though he did say he had a hand who had been meeting with some strangers recently, and he identified these strangers as being the men in the gang. The December 29th, 1928, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette reported that Mr. Wachowski was serving a 10-year sentence for his involvement with the gang. It also reports that his neighbors attempted to assist the ill Mrs. Wachowski and her 4 children. Their farm had been torn up by treasure hunters who would sneak around and dig up their property. I've seen later reports that Mr. Wachowski was later paroled because of the desperate situation that his family was placed in following his arrest, as members of the gang were found hiding out on his farm within 24 hours of the robbery. One of the Wachowski daughters, Alfreda, who was only 2 at the time of the robbery itself, would pass away in her home near the family farm, hundreds of yards, maybe just a couple miles from the family farm in 2004. She was survived by one older brother, Mitchell, who was 7 at the time of the robbery. He would be the last surviving witness of all this, and he would pass away at the age of 91. The state police came to the Wachowski farm, and searching around, they found 3 of the gang members, including Paul Jaworski. Jaworski owned up to the crime and even led the police to nearly a quarter of the heist, approximately $33,000. My understanding is that this was Jaworski's first big public heist, and that he was not on the police's radar until the Pittsburgh terminal coal robbery, this first armored car robbery. He was imprisoned, but with the assistance of some of the other flatheads or other acquaintances, he escaped and fled Pennsylvania. In the process, he killed a prison guard and injured several others. The following spring, he was involved in another very public robbery, this time at the Detroit Times. Jaworski may have been one of two gunmen who shot at and murdered a traffic patrolman as he was responding to the robbery at the Detroit Times. And of course, when you rob a newspaper, not only is a robbery guaranteed to be extremely public, but the news got out very fast. In fact, I read somewhere that the following edition of the Detroit Times had a map of their offices and had a family circus trail that showed the path that the robbers took, the members of the Flathead Gang took as they went through the Detroit Times. All in all, the violent Paul Jaworski would have 20 confirmed killings to his name, with perhaps 6 or 7 more which could be added, but are currently and most likely will forever be unsubstantiated. Paul Jaworski was eventually caught in mid-September 1928. He was meeting at a Cleveland restaurant with a fellow member of the Flathead Gang. The other gang member was able to sneak away through the back door, but Paul engaged in a gunfight with police. Some accounts state that the injuries he sustained left him paralyzed from the waist down. Others report that he had lost a finger in the fight, though I've read that he was missing a middle finger when he was initially apprehended at the Wachowski farm following the armored car robbery. But either way, Paul Jaworski led an organized and ambitious gang through Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. He left behind a wife and daughter. His daughter was not yet even a year old, and they were living in Detroit. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania executed Paul Jaworski on January 21st, 1929. And even though we're not exactly sure of when he was born, all accounts cite 1900, and so Paul Jaworski was not yet 30 years old. The Brinks Company, in a direct response to this robbery, would insist upon design improvements in their armored vehicles, including a steel plate floor. On March 11, 1927, the date of the armored car robbery, the truck's floor was wooden. To this day, nearly $66,000 of the armored car heist remains unaccounted for, and some people in the Bentleyville area of Washington County and others in southern Allegheny County insist that the money is still out there hidden, perhaps in a cave or buried somewhere on the Wachowski farm. The farm no longer exists, but I'm told that a spring house which dates to the mid-19th century and prior to the Wachowski's purchase of the farm is still standing and keeping its secrets to itself. To say that despite living where I do, I really struggle with Polish names, so I'm gonna spell it out for you, but it's Paul Jaworski, and that's Jaworski, and somebody will certainly correct me, and I'm just hoping that I remain consistent as I read this. The family farm is Wachowski, Weckoski. If you've got any interesting stories or pictures, feel free to email me at drpennsylvania@gmail.com.